Imagine being face to face with one of the most perplexing questions in spiritual history. Why didn't the Jewish people accept Jesus as the Messiah? This question isn't just old, it's ancient. It's tangled in centuries of tradition, prophecy, expectation, and heartbreak. Today, we're going to unpack this hidden truth, explore a mystery that challenges long-held beliefs, and maybe, just maybe, open your mind to a deeper understanding of faith and prophecy. So get ready, because what we're about to uncover could completely shift how you see not just history, but your own spiritual journey. Jesus' proof of being the Messiah. Let's start here. When Jesus arrived on the scene over 2,000 years ago, he didn't come quietly. He performed miracles that were nothing short of astonishing. Healings, casting out demons, restoring sight to the blind, even raising people from the dead. All of it happened right in front of the Jewish leaders who were thoroughly familiar with the prophecies of the Old Testament. So that leaves us with a haunting question. Why? Surrounded by overwhelming evidence, did the majority of Jewish people reject Jesus as their Messiah? That's exactly what we'll explore today, and we'll look at for major reasons why. Reason number 1, misunderstanding prophecy. The first big reason is actually a fascinating one. It revolves around how Old Testament prophecies describe both the first and second coming of the Messiah, yet many people at the time didn't realize there would be two separate events. You see, there were plenty of prophecies Jesus did fulfill. Isaiah chapter 11 detailed the character of the Messiah. Micah 5 pinpointed Bethlehem as his birthplace. Isaiah 53 spoke in heartbreaking detail about his suffering and death. Daniel chapter 9 even laid out the exact time frame for the Messiah's arrival. But there were other prophecies about worldwide peace, about the Messiah ruling with a rod of iron, about nations no longer learning war that didn't happen when Jesus first came. And that's because those are tied to his second coming, something the prophets themselves didn't fully see. To them, it was like looking at two mountain peaks from afar. They couldn't tell there was a long valley of time between them. Paul talks about this in his letters. He says there was a mystery hidden for ages, that the Messiah's plan would unfold into stages, and that Gentiles would be included in God's promises in a way no one had fully grasped before. So when Jesus didn't immediately overthrow Roman rule and establish an earthly kingdom, many Jewish leaders concluded he simply couldn't be the Messiah. Expectations in Jesus' day, and to understand just how powerful that expectation was, you have to see the backdrop. At the time Jesus began his ministry, the Jewish people were living under harsh Roman occupation. They couldn't govern themselves. They paid heavy taxes. They longed for freedom. So naturally, they clung to the prophecies of a Messiah who would come and liberate Israel, who would crush their enemies and bring about a new golden age where they ruled their own land. That's why, even after Jesus rose from the dead, his own disciples asked him in Acts chapter 1, "Lord, is it at this time you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel?" Even they were still thinking about a political, earthly kingdom. But Jesus' response showed his kingdom had a very different nature. He preached, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." It wasn't about an earthly throne just yet. It was about hearts turning back to God, about spiritual transformation first. Reason number 2, perceived blasphemy. That brings us to the second major reason the Jewish people rejected Jesus. They believed he was committing outright blasphemy. In Judaism, one of the most sacred declarations is the Shema from Deuteronomy 6. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." It's the heartbeat of Jewish faith. From childhood, every Jewish person recited it daily. It anchored their understanding that God was absolutely singular and could not be embodied by any man. Then Jesus came along, and he didn't just teach about God, he claimed equality with God. In John 8:58, Jesus said, "Before Abraham was, I am." That wasn't a poetic flourish. He was echoing God's very name given to Moses at the burning bush. "I am who I am." The Jewish leaders grasped exactly what he was saying. That's why they picked up stones to kill him on the spot. They believed Jesus was crossing a line so sacred it demanded execution. Later in John 10:30, Jesus went even further, saying, I and the Father are one, to Jewish ears. That was the ultimate blasphemy, equating himself with YHWH, the one true God. It violated everything they have been taught to believe since they were toddlers. Reason number 3, challenging their teachings. And there is a third reason. Jesus didn't just claim divine authority. He also challenged many of the religious interpretations and traditions of his day. That rattled the leaders even more. Rabbis and Pharisees had built an intricate system of laws and customs around the Torah. These weren't just rules, they were a way of life, a fence meant to protect the holiness of Israel. So when Jesus began to question their practices, like when he asked why they used temple vows as an excuse not to support their parents, or when he healed on the Sabbath, it wasn't just a theological disagreement. It felt like he was dismantling the very fabric of their society. In Matthew 15, when the Pharisees accused Jesus' disciples of eating without ceremonially washing their hands, Jesus flipped the script. He pointed out that honoring human tradition shouldn't override God's command to care for your family. For religious leaders whose entire authority rested on guarding these traditions, Jesus was a revolutionary and a dangerous one at that. That's the first stretch of our journey. In part 2, we'll go deeper into how Jesus' teachings on forgiveness and spiritual authority rocked the foundations of Jewish belief, and we'll see how their reactions unfolded into one of the most dramatic moments in all of history. Reason number 4, the cost of following Jesus. Alright, now let us explore one of the most human reasons why many Jewish people rejected Jesus as the Messiah: the enormous personal cost. Think about what it meant back then to follow Jesus. It wasn't just adopting a few new ideas. It often meant being cast out of your community, losing your place in the synagogue, becoming a social outcast overnight. In John chapter 9, there's a powerful story about Jesus healing a man who was blind from birth. When the Pharisees interrogated this man and his parents, the parents were terrified to say outright that Jesus had healed him. Why? Because the text says they feared being put out of the synagogue. It was social and religious exile, losing family, neighbors, business ties, everything. Later in John 12:42, we see it again. It says many even among the rulers believed in Jesus, but because of the Pharisees, they would not openly acknowledge their faith for fear they would be put out of the synagogue. For many Jewish people, accepting Jesus as Messiah wasn't just a private belief. It was choosing to give up their social world, risking being cut off from everything they knew. That's a monumental sacrifice, and for many, it was a cost too high to pay. The deeper spiritual dilemma, but underneath all of this lay something even deeper, a spiritual struggle that goes beyond logic, prophecy charts, or even social pressures. The Apostle Paul, himself a devout Jew who once persecuted Christians, later explained this mystery in Romans chapter 11. He wrote that God had allowed a partial hardening to come upon Israel. Why? So that salvation could be offered to the Gentiles, fulfilling God's larger plan to bless all nations through Abraham's line. It's one of the most mysterious and awe-inspiring parts of the biblical story. Paul even says it should stir humility in Gentile believers, because God's ultimate design still includes Israel. He writes that one day all Israel will be saved, showing God hasn't forgotten his covenant promises. So what seemed like outright rejection by Israel was, on another level, woven into a divine strategy that stretched far beyond what any human could see. The gospel goes to the Gentiles. This opens up an incredible twist in the narrative, because Israel largely didn't recognize Jesus as Messiah. The message of salvation spread to the Gentile world, to Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, Syrians, and eventually to people on every continent. Jesus hinted at this when he told the parable of the wedding feast. In Matthew 22, he describes a king throwing a banquet, but the invited guests refuse to come. So what does the king do? He sends his servants into the streets to invite anyone they can find, both good and bad, to fill the wedding hall. That's exactly what happened with the gospel. When many in Israel rejected the invitation, the doors swung wide open to the nations. Paul became the foremost apostle to the Gentiles, traveling thousands of miles enduring shipwrecks, beatings, and imprisonment to spread the message that salvation through the Jewish Messiah was now offered to all people. It was a plan far bigger and more generous than anyone could have imagined. A story that isn't over yet, but here's where things get even more profound. This story isn't over. According to biblical prophecy, the day will come when the Jewish people will recognize Jesus as their Messiah. Zechariah 12:10 says, "They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child." It's a haunting, beautiful image, a nation realizing who their Messiah truly is. Paul builds on this in Romans 11, declaring that if Israel's stumbling brought blessings to the world, how much more will their full restoration mean? It will be like life from the dead. That means history is moving somewhere. The rejection of Jesus by many Jewish people wasn't the final word. It was a chapter in a much larger story of redemption that God is still writing. Personal reflection. Why does this matter? So what does all this mean for you and me, living thousands of years later? It means we're part of a story that's far bigger than ourselves. It means God's promises are unbreakable, even when people fail to see them. It means the same God who wove together this mysterious plan through centuries of human misunderstanding is still at work today, in our lives, in our doubts, in our hopes, and it challenges us. If the Jewish people missed their Messiah because he didn't fit their expectations, maybe we should pause and ask, are there ways we've limited God because he doesn't look like we thought he would? Because at the end of the day, faith isn't just about getting all the theological pieces to line up perfectly. It's about humbly recognizing that God's ways are higher, his timeline is longer, and his story is more breathtaking than we could ever script on our own. In part 3, we'll explore some of the most powerful implications of this entire narrative for our own lives today, including what it teaches us about humility, waiting, and how to keep our hearts open to God's unexpected work. Why this matters for us today? Alright, let's bring this story home, because all these historical details, these prophecies, these ancient misunderstandings, they aren't just interesting trivia, they're a mirror for us. Think about it. The Jewish people were God's chosen nation. They knew the scriptures inside out. They longed for the Messiah for centuries. And yet, when he finally stood right in front of them, most didn't recognize him. Why? Because he didn't fit the picture they had painted in their minds. They expected a warrior king, not a humble teacher. They wanted a throne in Jerusalem, not a cross outside its walls. So here's the haunting question. Are we any different? How often do we miss God's work in our own lives simply because it doesn't look like what we expected? We ask for blessing, and he sends hardship to shape our character. We pray for peace, and he gives us opportunities to forgive, which can be painful. We want victory, and he walks us through valleys first. In a way, the rejection of Jesus by his own people is a sobering lesson for all of us. It's a reminder that God's greatest work often comes in forms we least expect. What IT teaches us about humility and trust. That's why Paul writes in Romans 11 that Gentile believers should never become arrogant. He uses the metaphor of an olive tree. Israel is the natural root, and we, as Gentiles, are like branches grafted in. He says clearly, do not be arrogant, but tremble. Because if God's own chosen people could stumble through pride or rigid expectations, so could we. It's a call to humility, to trust that God's timeline is perfect, even if it feels delayed, to trust that his ways are good, even when they're confusing. Because here's the bigger picture. God didn't abandon Israel. Paul says all Israel will be saved, and that God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. That should thrill us. It means he keeps his promises, no matter how long it takes. And if he's faithful to them, he'll be faithful to us too. Seeing God's bigger story, maybe that's the biggest takeaway from this entire journey. When we look at why the Jewish people rejected Jesus, it's tempting to stand at a distance and shake our heads. But the real wisdom comes where we let it turn the spotlight on ourselves. Are we open to God moving in unexpected ways? Are we willing to let him be bigger than our traditions, our preferences, our timelines? Because God's story is so much more intricate and astonishing than anything we could draw up. It's like a master artist painting on a canvas that stretches across centuries. We're standing so close, we only see a few brush strokes. But one day, when we step back, we'll gasp at the beauty of the whole masterpiece. My personal invitation, so here's my invitation to you. Keep your heart tender. Stay curious. Don't box God in. Maybe you've wrestled with doubt or disappointment because God didn't show up the way you thought he would. Or maybe, like many in Israel back then, you've been waiting for a king to fix everything externally, when he first wants to transform you internally. Jesus is still the Messiah who comes to rule, not just over nations, but over hearts. And maybe the most radical, comforting truth is that even when we misunderstand or miss him, his love keeps pursuing us. Ending reflection plus call to engage. So, what about you? What part of this story stirred something deep in you? Was it realizing how easy it is to miss God's voice because of our own expectations? Or was it the astonishing patience of God's plan that takes thousands of years, yet never fails? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely love to hear how this hits you, because sometimes your perspective is exactly what someone else here needs to read. And if this journey opened your eyes in any way, consider subscribing. On this channel, we dig into stories that have shaped entire civilizations, stories that still whisper to us today, if we're willing to listen. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. Remember, God's plans are far bigger and more beautiful than we can imagine. Stay humble, stay open, and keep seeking. See you in the next video.